The story of Michael Bruce Ross begins in the quiet countryside of Putnam, Connecticut, a place where rolling fields, aging barns, and sparsely populated backroads formed the backdrop to a childhood that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. He was born on July 26, 1959, the oldest child in a family that seemed respectable from the outside. But behind the walls of their farmhouse, the atmosphere was often volatile, dark, and emotionally unpredictable. In later years, Ross would describe his home life as a place where affection was rare, discipline was harsh, and tension simmered constantly. His father was distant, sometimes explosive, and his mother's behavior fluctuated dramatically. As a child, Ross learned to stay quiet, stay obedient, and stay unnoticed. This emotional void grew larger when he discovered an unsettling fascination with the idea of control. Even as a boy, he preferred solitude, wandering through woods, hiding in barns, and observing animals. Over time, those observations took on a frightening shape. Like many serial offenders who develop violent tendencies early, Ross began killing small animals. At first, it was accidental, so he claimed, but soon he admitted the killings became intentional. He strangled chickens on the family farm, watching the life leave their bodies, feeling a sense of power that he never felt within his own household. These early acts of cruelty were disturbing warning signs, but no one around him recognized what they would one day become. Despite this hidden darkness, Ross excelled academically. His intelligence was undeniable, and teachers described him as quiet, polite, and serious, nothing that hinted at the inner storms he kept secret. He graduated near the top of his high school class and eventually earned a place at Cornell University, one of the country's most prestigious institutions. It was an unexpected leap for someone who had grown up in a troubled rural home. Cornell represented escape, a fresh start, and an identity far removed from the boy who hid in barns and strangled animals in silence. But college did not cure him. It only gave him new environments to navigate his private compulsions. At Cornell, Ross was outwardly a model student. He studied economics, participated in clubs, and dated occasionally, though he struggled with relationships. Women saw him as shy, perhaps even awkward, but never threatening. Under that exterior, however, Ross was battling violent urges that grew stronger with each passing year. The fantasies took root, then began to bloom. He imagined overpowering women, controlling them, taking away their freedom in the same way he had taken the lives of those animals years earlier. He tried to resist the urges, but resistance only seemed to fuel the obsession. His first attempts at acting on those fantasies came in the form of stalking. He followed women on campus, memorizing their schedules, studying their habits. The compulsion to hunt grew stronger. Some serial killers escalate slowly, almost cautiously, but Ross's progression was steady and calculated. He tested boundaries, breaking into dorms, sneaking through hallways at night, quietly approaching female students who were unaware of the danger walking behind them. He later admitted that these early crimes were trial runs, testing how close he could get without being caught. In 1981, he graduated from Cornell and entered the real world with a degree and an image that impressed nearly everyone who met him. No one suspected he had already crossed dangerous lines. After leaving college, Ross returned to Connecticut, where his fantasies became more focused. He lived alone, often isolated, and the loneliness deepened his compulsions. In his mind, the worlds of fantasy and reality began to blend, and the boundary separating thoughts from actions eroded. By early 1982, Ross was no longer satisfied with simply watching or following potential victims. He wanted control, domination, and the feeling he had experienced as a boy on the farm, but now directed at human beings. His stalking increased. He drove the winding roads of Connecticut and Massachusetts, searching for opportunity. He targeted young women walking alone, often teenagers, often vulnerable. For Ross, these roads offered anonymity, quiet stretches of forest, long gaps between houses, and limited surveillance. It was a predator's ideal hunting ground, and soon people would nickname him the Roadside Strangler, without knowing the identity of the man terrorizing their communities. Ross's first confirmed murder occurred on May 12, 1981, though some investigators believe he may have attempted earlier attacks. The victim was a 25-year-old woman from Brooklyn, but it wasn't until years later that the crime was connected to him. At the time, police found little evidence, and the case quickly went cold. Ross felt exhilarated but frightened after the killing, afraid not of what he had done, but of how intoxicating it felt. The taste of control, the silence in the moments after the violence, the terrifying sense of power, all of it reinforced the hunger that had been growing for years. After that, his fantasies became more violent, more detailed, and more relentless. By 1982, Ross had developed a method. He chose isolated roads, watched from a distance, then approached quickly and quietly. His victims were often teenage girls walking home from school or hitchhiking, a common practice at the time. Ross offered rides or simply overpowered them. Once he had them alone, he subdued them through force, strangling them with his hands or using makeshift ligatures. He later described the murders in disturbingly calm detail, explaining every step of his process as though it were a routine. One of his early victims was a 17-year-old girl named Tammy Williams, who disappeared while walking home from her high school. Her case shook the small Connecticut community. Friends described her as cheerful, ambitious, and well-liked. When she failed to return home, authorities initially suspected she may have run away, but her family insisted that she would never leave voluntarily. That insistence proved true. Her body was discovered days later in a wooded area, partially concealed, showing signs of strangulation. The brutality shocked investigators, but they had no leads, no witnesses, and no suspect. Ross had struck carefully, leaving minimal traces behind. After Tammy, Ross became bolder. He convinced himself that he was untouchable, that he could continue indefinitely as long as he planned meticulously. His murders were not impulsive, they were calculated. He scouted locations, watched his victims, and prepared escape routes. As months passed, the pattern became clearer, to police only in hindsight, but to Ross, it was the shape of his compulsions refining themselves. Each murder brought him temporary relief from the violent urges that tormented him, but the relief never lasted. Within weeks, sometimes days, the fantasies returned stronger. In November 1983, Ross kidnapped and murdered two 14-year-old girls, Leslie Shelley and April Bruns, who were best friends from Griswold High School. Their disappearance devastated their town. When their bodies were eventually found in a forested area near the Rhode Island border, investigators were horrified by the similarities to previous unsolved cases. Young victims, strangulation, and evidence suggesting the killer had controlled them methodically. Still, police struggled to connect the dots. This was the early 1980s, before modern forensic databases, before widespread DNA cataloging, before behavioral profiling had become standard practice. Ross exploited the gaps in law enforcement structure, always staying one step ahead. Throughout this period, Ross maintained a remarkably normal facade. He held steady jobs, paid his bills, dated women, and even attended family events. He visited relatives, held conversations, and presented himself as mild-mannered and polite. That ordinary exterior helped him avoid suspicion for years. Many serial killers rely on charm, but Ross relied on inconspicuousness. He didn't stand out, didn't cause trouble, didn't draw eyes. He lived quietly, predictably, except for the nights when he sought victims along rural highways. But as his fantasy life consumed more of his thoughts, cracks began to appear in his public persona. He drank more heavily. He became socially withdrawn. He struggled to maintain relationships. The double life he was living, respectful citizen by day, predator by night, strained his mental stability. Each murder took an emotional toll, not in the form of guilt, but in the way it intensified the conflict between the life he showed the world and the life he lived in secret. The turning point came in early 1984, when Ross abducted and murdered an 18-year-old woman named Robin Stavinsky. This time, he made mistakes. There were witnesses who saw a man matching his description in the area. A vehicle that resembled his car was reported near the crime scene. For the first time, pieces of the puzzle began aligning. Investigators started building a composite sketch and comparing suspects, though Ross remained off their radar. Still, his margin for error was shrinking. On June 13, 1984, Ross committed what would become the murder that finally led to his capture. His victim was 17-year-old Wendy Barrybalt, a high school student from Connecticut. She disappeared while walking to a friend's house. Her body was discovered soon after, strangled, concealed, and left in a wooded area. But this time, witnesses provided police with a description of a man who had been seen circling the area in a blue car. That vehicle would soon lead detectives to Ross. As the investigation intensified, Ross felt the pressure closing in. The urge to kill had not diminished, but his ability to operate freely was slipping. Patrols increased. Communities were on alert. Mothers instructed their children not to walk alone. Schools warned students to stay in groups. The fear that spread through Connecticut was palpable, and the killer who had once moved unseen now felt the weight of suspicion everywhere he went. Despite that pressure, Ross continued trying to live his ordinary life, thinking that his quiet demeanor would shield him. But patterns were forming, links emerging, and soon investigators would identify the man behind the killings on Connecticut's quiet roads. Everything was beginning to unravel, as reports from terrified townspeople poured into police stations across eastern Connecticut. The pressure on investigators intensified. Each new murder created a ripple of panic stretching from small neighborhoods to entire counties. The fear was no longer contained to isolated areas. Parents throughout the region warned their teenage daughters not to walk anywhere alone. Local newspapers published front-page stories, broadcasting the threat of a serial predator. Though authorities avoided using the term serial killer publicly at first, the similarities between cases were undeniable. Young, vulnerable victims, sudden disappearances, wooded dump sites, and the unmistakable method of strangulation. Whoever was committing these crimes was organized, deliberate, and growing increasingly confident. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions began working together, something that was less common in the early 1980s. They created task forces, compared notes, and searched for overlapping clues. The cases spanned multiple counties and even crossed into neighboring states, complicating the investigation. Some departments hesitated to share information, wanting jurisdictional control, but the brutality of the crimes forced cooperation. While investigators were struggling to catch up, Michael Ross lived in a fragile equilibrium between his outward normalcy and the violent urges controlling his secret life. To coworkers, he appeared quiet and somewhat shy but reliable. He showed up to work on time, did his tasks without complaint, and avoided conflict. His neighbors thought of him as polite but distant. They saw him carrying groceries, loading his car, or mowing the small lawn in front of his apartment building, ordinary behaviors masking extraordinary darkness. But inside Ross's mind, chaos was growing. The killings no longer satisfied him for long. The fantasies returned faster, demanding more attention, consuming his days. He carried memories of his crimes with unsettling calmness, replaying them mentally, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and how he could improve the next time. For Ross, each murder was a meticulous procedure, a twisted project that required planning and precision. He kept track of newspaper reports, noting the lack of leads and convincing himself that he remained invisible. Yet the illusion of invisibility was beginning to crack. After the murder of Wendy Barrybalt in June 1984, police received multiple reports of a suspicious man seen driving slowly through Wendy's neighborhood. Eyewitnesses described a blue compact car circling the area. One witness told police she saw the driver staring at girls walking along the road. She remembered the intensity of his gaze, the way he tracked them as if studying them. That detail stuck with investigators. They canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents to report anyone who drove a similar car. Meanwhile, Ross, sensing the growing scrutiny, attempted to restrain himself. He told himself repeatedly that he needed to stop, but every time he tried, a familiar tension built inside him, the same consuming urge he had felt since his teenage years. He found himself driving without purpose, cruising rural roads for hours, scanning sidewalks, schoolyards, parks, anywhere young girls might walk. He wanted to stop, yet he was incapable of resisting the compulsion that had defined him for years. In late June 1984, Ross made a critical mistake. He returned to the same area where Wendy had disappeared. A local resident, already on high alert after the neighborhood was flooded with police, recognized his blue car and wrote down part of the license plate. She reported it immediately. When the plate number was run through state databases, it was traced to Michael Bruce Ross, a man with no violent criminal history, but someone who fit the physical description reported by several witnesses. Detectives decided to speak with him. Initially, Ross seemed cooperative, polite, even helpful. He agreed to an interview without hesitation, believing he could outsmart the police. He had always relied on appearing harmless, and for most of his life, that facade had protected him. But this time, detectives were more prepared. They subtly pressed him about his whereabouts on the day Wendy disappeared. Ross gave vague, uncertain answers, claiming he didn't remember. That inconsistency immediately raised suspicion. What would ultimately trap Ross, however, was not his interview but his car. Authorities impounded his vehicle for testing. Inside the upholstery, carpet fibers and trunk lining, forensic examiners discovered hair fibers and traces that suggested victims had been inside the car. The evidence was enough to justify further questioning. Days later, Ross was brought back in, and this time he sensed the walls closing in. During the interrogation, something strange happened. Ross began to unravel, not in fear but in relief. Investigators later described how he seemed emotionally exhausted, as though he had been waiting for someone to catch him. After hours of questioning, Ross finally broke. He confessed to killing Wendy Baribald. Then he confessed to killing Robin Stavinsky. Then, in chilling detail, he admitted to additional murders stretching back several years. By the end of the session, detectives realized they were dealing with one of the most prolific serial killers in Connecticut's history. The confession shocked law enforcement. Ross described each crime with unnerving calmness, showing little emotion except when discussing the internal torment that drove him. His affect was flat, his voice steady, and his explanations disturbingly organized. When asked why he committed the murders, Ross responded with a chilling simplicity. The compulsion overwhelmed him. He spoke about a deep-seated urge he couldn't control, a dark craving that surfaced repeatedly regardless of his attempts to suppress it. What disturbed investigators even more was Ross's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the violence. He didn't attempt to justify the murders. He didn't blame his childhood, though he admitted it contributed to his psychological issues. He simply stated that he felt compelled to kill, and that his victims gave him a sense of control he never experienced in his normal life. With Ross in custody, authorities began linking him definitively to 8 murders, though some investigators suspected additional victims. The families of the murdered girls were notified, sparking waves of grief and disbelief. For some, the revelation brought a painful sense of closure. For others, it reopened wounds they had tried to heal. With each new detail revealed in the media, the horror deepened. Communities that had lived in fear for years finally learned the identity of the man who had stalked their roads, and the revelation was both shocking and devastating. Ross's legal journey became as complex as his crimes were brutal. Initially, his defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill and incapable of fully understanding his actions. They prepared to pursue an insanity plea, hoping to spare him the death penalty, but Ross rejected that strategy. He did not want to claim insanity. He insisted he was responsible for his actions and understood what he had done. More than that, Ross made a startling declaration. He wanted the death penalty. His attorneys were stunned. Most defendants facing execution fight desperately to avoid it, but Ross said he didn't want to live in prison for decades, haunted by memories and compulsions he believed would never leave him. He told the court, with chilling clarity, that he deserved to die for what he had done. His decision sparked legal debates, media attention, and public outrage. Some argued he was attempting to manipulate the system. Others believed he genuinely felt remorse, or at least resignation. The trial was emotionally draining for the families of the victims. They listened to graphic testimony, forensic evidence, and Ross's own chilling accounts. Every detail reminded them of the young lives stolen and the futures erased. When prosecutors presented the photographs, timelines, and physical evidence, it painted a picture of a methodical predator who had preyed on vulnerability with ruthless precision. In 1987, Michael Ross was convicted of multiple counts of capital felony and murder. The court sentenced him to death. For many, the verdict brought relief, but the case was far from over. Over the next several years, legal battles erupted. Appeals, motions, psychological evaluations, and challenges to the death penalty delayed the execution repeatedly. While some argued that Ross should be kept alive due to mental illness, Ross himself remained consistent. He wanted the sentence carried out. The situation became even more complicated when anti-death penalty advocates entered the fight. Some activists argued that Ross was not mentally competent to choose execution. They filed lawsuits on his behalf, even when Ross insisted he wished to abandon all appeals. The legal tug-of-war became national news. Journalists debated whether Ross was suicidal, mentally ill, or simply accepting of his fate. While the legal battles raged, Ross spent years on death row at Northern Correctional Institution, reflecting on his crimes. He corresponded with people outside prison, including clergy members, volunteers, and even students studying criminal psychology. He wrote letters describing his internal struggles and attempts to understand the roots of his violent compulsions. At times, he expressed remorse, saying he hoped the families of his victims could eventually heal. At other times, he detached himself emotionally, speaking about his crimes with the same numb clarity he displayed during interrogations. As Connecticut approached carrying out its first execution in decades, the state's legal system endured intense scrutiny. The complexity of Ross's case, his desire for execution, the objections from advocacy groups, and the moral implications created one of the most controversial death penalty debates in the region's history. By 2005, nearly 20 years after his conviction, the final legal obstacles began to crumble. Courts determined that Ross was mentally competent to waive further appeals. He signed documents reaffirming his desire for the death penalty to be carried out. Despite last-minute efforts by opponents, including emergency motions and protests, the courts upheld his right to proceed. As the execution date approached, the atmosphere across Connecticut grew tense. Media vans lined up outside the prison. Reporters discussed the legal and ethical implications daily. Families of victims were offered the chance to attend the execution, though some declined, choosing instead to remember their loved ones as they once were, rather than in association with their killer's final moments. Inside the prison, Ross appeared calm. Staff members observed him reading, praying, and writing letters in the days leading up to his death. He ate his final meals quietly, spoke politely to guards, and prepared himself for what he called an ending that should have come long ago. The night before the execution, a small crowd formed outside the prison, some protesting, some supporting, all bearing witness. Connecticut had not executed an inmate in more than 40 years. The significance of the event reverberated through news outlets nationwide. Observers debated whether carrying out the execution would bring closure or only perpetuate violence. As dawn approached on May 13, 2005, preparations inside the death chamber began. In the early hours of May 13, 2005, the atmosphere surrounding the Northern Correctional Institution was heavy and silent. A crowd had gathered outside the facility long before sunrise, some carrying signs calling for justice, others holding candles in solemn protest. The prison's stark exterior was illuminated by media lights, the hum of news vans mixing with murmurs from spectators waiting for an event that hadn't occurred in the state of Connecticut for more than 4 decades: the execution of a condemned inmate. Inside, behind thick concrete walls and layers of security, Michael Bruce Ross waited in his cell, knowing that his final hours had arrived. Ross had spent nearly 20 years on death row. During that time, he had come to terms with what he believed was inevitable. Unlike many death row inmates who clung to appeals until the last moment, Ross had insisted repeatedly that he wanted the execution carried out. For him, the punishment was a conclusion he felt he deserved, and in conversations with clergy members and counselors, he expressed a desire to end the cycle of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and public controversy that had surrounded his case for so long. Just after midnight, prison staff began the formal preparations. Ross was moved from his cell to a holding area near the execution chamber, the corridor echoing with footsteps, the metallic clang of doors closing behind him, the low voices of guards reading instructions. Everything carried a sense of finality. Those who witnessed him described his demeanor as calm, composed, almost eerily resigned. He offered polite responses, thanking correctional officers for their professionalism. Even in his final hours, he maintained the quiet, soft-spoken personality that had allowed him to go unnoticed during the years he stalked his victims across Connecticut. Ross had spent the previous evening writing final letters. He had written to a small number of people who had maintained correspondence with him over the years, including a minister who had visited him regularly. In those letters, Ross expressed remorse for the pain he had caused and conveyed hopes that his death might eventually bring the victims' families some measure of peace. Whether those words reflected genuine regret or simply a final attempt at emotional resolution remains a subject of debate among psychologists and criminologists. As dawn approached, the designated witnesses, journalists, prison officials, and representatives of the victims' families began to assemble. They passed through security checks and were escorted to a viewing area overlooking the execution chamber. Emotions among them ranged from sorrow to anger to quiet resolve. For some family members who had chosen to attend, the execution represented closure. For others, it was a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. A few declined to witness the execution, choosing instead to remember their daughters privately, without the shadow of the man who had taken their lives. The execution chamber itself was stark, almost clinical. A narrow bed stood at the center, its white straps prepared to secure Ross's arms and legs. Monitors were positioned nearby, ready to track his heartbeat. A curtain separated the chamber from the area where witnesses would watch. Beyond another partition, unseen to the viewing area, medical personnel and correctional staff prepared the syringes and equipment necessary for the lethal injection. Just after 2:00 a.m., Ross was escorted into the chamber. He walked steadily, showing no visible signs of fear or hesitation. He lay down on the bed without resistance, allowing the staff to fasten the restraints. His expression remained composed, his breathing calm. The sterile smell of the room, the soft hum of ventilation, and the low whispers of staff members moving through rehearsed procedures all created an atmosphere that felt suspended in time. Before the execution began, Ross was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Witnesses leaned forward, waiting to hear his last words. He spoke quietly, his voice measured. He apologized to the families of his victims, acknowledging the enormous pain he had caused. He said he hoped his death would help them find healing, though he understood that nothing he said or did could ever undo the harm. When he finished speaking, he closed his eyes, a faint look of exhaustion crossing his face. Whether it was the weight of his crimes, the long years of imprisonment, or the knowledge that his life was ending, no one could say with certainty. At 2:08 a.m. the execution began. A series of chemicals flowed through the IV lines inserted into Ross's arms. The first drug induced unconsciousness, causing his body to relax visibly. The second drug stopped his breathing, and the third brought his heart to a halt. The entire process took less than 20 minutes. By 2:25 a.m., a physician pronounced Michael Bruce Ross dead. Outside the prison, word of the execution spread quickly. Reporters delivered updates to television stations and newspapers across the nation. Some framed the event as justice long overdue. Others questioned the moral implications of capital punishment. Connecticut's political and legal communities immediately began debating whether Ross's execution marked a reaffirmation of the state's commitment to the death penalty or an isolated case shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Inside the viewing area, reactions varied. Some of the victims' relatives cried quietly, overwhelmed by emotion. Others stared silently, processing the reality that the man responsible for their daughters' deaths was now gone. A few expressed relief, saying that the execution closed a chapter that had haunted them for decades. Yet even in that moment, grief lingered. The death of a killer did not erase the memories of the young women who had never come home. After Ross's body was removed from the chamber, prison personnel methodically dismantled the equipment and restored the room to its usual state. The process of clearing the execution chamber was routine for staff members who, despite the rarity of executions in Connecticut, had trained extensively for this moment. For them, the event was part of a duty they did not take lightly. Many later described the night as somber and emotionally taxing. As dawn broke over the prison complex, protesters dispersed, reporters packed their equipment, and the quiet rural surroundings returned to their usual stillness. But the case of Michael Bruce Ross continued to reverberate throughout the state and across the country. His execution reignited debates about criminal psychology, the nature of violent compulsions, and the limits of the justice system. Scholars studied his case, analyzing the combination of early childhood trauma, psychological imbalance, and escalating fantasies that led him to become a serial murderer. The detailed interviews he gave during his incarceration became valuable material for criminologists attempting to understand the minds of sexually motivated killers. In the months following Ross's execution, Connecticut continued to wrestle with the future of its death penalty laws. His case became a focal point for both supporters and opponents of capital punishment. Supporters argued that the death penalty had brought closure to the victims' families and served as a just consequence for Ross's heinous acts. Opponents, however, claimed that the drawn-out legal process, combined with the complexities surrounding Ross's mental state and willingness to die, highlighted deep flaws in the system. In 2012, 7 years after Ross's death, Connecticut abolished the death penalty for future crimes, although the repeal was not retroactive.